Great. So yeah, good morning, everybody. I'm so grateful to be here with all of you on this really beautiful day. And I share in your anticipation of Dr. Brondizio's keynote later this afternoon after lunch. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is David Hecht, and I'm in the 6th year of the program here. I recently returned from almost 2 years spent in Bhutan, where I conduct my research. Given the congenial nature of our gathering today, I wanted to explore and sort of play around a bit with the title of my talk today, adding some integrative alliteration, if you will, ornithologies and ontologies, wherein I'll be focusing on one of my dissertation chapters primarily and exploring some of the results from our participatory mapping and counter mapping methods that highlight more than human worlds of conservation and protection in Bhutan. So for those unfamiliar, ontology being a term I'm using in this context in the contemporary cultural anthropology world used to describe shared cultural realities or shared cultural worlds, if you will. A similar term you may be familiar with, epistemology, is used in the discipline to describe a system of knowledge or worldviews. So I just wanted to add that clarification up front. Ornithologies, in this case, I'll be using to describe the many ways in which birds exist in our human worlds across languages and cultures. It is a term encompassing who birds are to ourselves and others, including the stories we associate with them. I just recently heard this term used on one of my favorite podcast series by Drew Lanham, who some of you may know as a professor, author, birder, conservationist, and an incredible interdisciplinary scholar. So that was really cool. All right, so we're deep in it now. Before we start, just some gratitude and acknowledgement of my collaborators, of course, my advisor and committee members, and the grant agencies that supported and are supporting this work. So let's start here. Even before I joined the ICON graduate program, I was working in Bhutan with the Royal Society for Protection of Nature, the kingdom's first and only environmental conservation NGO. They have an impressive 30+ years leading community-based conservation projects. Two of their central programs focus on these bird species, the white-bellied herons and the black-necked cranes. White-bellied herons are a critically endangered species with less than 60 known individuals worldwide, making them the rarest heron species in the world and perhaps the rarest bird in Asia. Black-necked cranes, on the other hand, are doing pretty well. They're found in Tibet, China, and Bhutan, and they're revered in the kingdom. They're a near threatened species with a global population between 9 and 11,000. A small subset of their population winters in Bhutan. Now, there are longstanding campaigns in the country to protect critical riverine habitat for the white-bellied heron, particularly in light of large-scale hydropower dam construction in the country. RSPN and other authorities have joined with local community partners to monitor white-bellied heron numbers and nesting sites in the country's deep river gorges. I won't have time today to get into the complexities and politics of white-bellied heron conservation. You can get a copy of my dissertation for that. But there are some really interesting things happening here. Black-necked cranes, on the other hand, the other focal species in conservation in the country, are widely considered to be heavenly birds, richly intertwined in the fabric of places and local communities to exist in songs and stories, embodied in dance and in songs, and painted on walls and in the homes of temples, even carved into the ornate pillars of Gangte Gimpa Monastery, alongside dragons and powerful protective deities you see there in the top left photo. Every year, there is also a festival dedicated to the winter arrival of black-necked cranes from their breeding grounds in Tibet, and that is pictured there on the right. So my ethnographic work works within the home ranges of these two bird species, recognizing that such distinctive ornithologies condition the ways in which conservation is practiced in the kingdom. So here is a range map of black-necked cranes, and on top, the sliver of river where white-bellied herons are found. There has been a fair amount of research on the ecology and indeed spatial ecologies of these species in the region, but very little research on the cultural, social, and political context of their habitat and the conservation protected areas and programs that have emerged over the years. RSPN has formed long-term partnerships and strong community-oriented programs for the species. But as a cultural anthropologist, I wanted to know more about the relationships between local communities and their surrounding ecologies, and more precisely, the shared cultural realities that inform the dynamic landscapes and are informed by the dynamic landscapes in which they live. So over a period of 3+ years, that was the goal of our research, to spend time to deeply hang out, as it is often said, with RSPN's community partners in the places where conservation for these two focal species was happening. That is, to invite them to add their own voices in their own words, and to share their knowledge of their communities, traditions, languages, knowledge of these important habitats, and to quite literally put them on the map. And the more we asked our community partners to mark what was and is important to them and their families on the map, the more stories emerged of powerful, often invisible, more than human beings that intersect with local conservation and development politics in the kingdom. So although my research covers a lot of ground, that is really my starting point. While there are, of course, many religious expressions in Bhutan, it is the pre-Buddhist belief systems, so indigenous animism or Bonche, which has been historically fortified by Tibetan Buddhism, that is so deeply enmeshed and inscribed in the Bhutanese landscape. In this religious context, local deities and non-human spirits occupy territory on the landscape in forests, cliffs, rocks, lakes and springs, and frequently old growth trees, such as the giant cypress tree you see here in the photo. This is the abode of a local deity, and offerings and libations are made to appease them, to prevent illness in the community, to ensure good harvests and healthy livestock, to prevent natural disasters, things like this. And so these gods of the territory and settlements go by many different names, but are generally referred to as Yulajida or Nedajida, and their territories are described as the deity's palace or a citadel of the deity, or Podrang in Dzongkha. Generally in these areas, in these territories, one is not allowed to cut down trees or pollute the area, either physically or spiritually, and many of these areas have been thus protected from exploitation or degradation, safeguarded by local communities, and often considered prior to any development projects, such as the building of a school or a road or any kind of structure or house. As things change in the country, so too do these traditions and the knowledge linked therein. These highly spatial ontologies, shared cultural realities, are changing too. So many of the questions I had and have at this intersection were spatial questions, how these relationships are negotiated and how they interface or not with ongoing efforts to conserve and protect areas for focal species. So today, my second question is probably most relevant, and I ask, how do local communities spatially negotiate the diversity of types of protected spaces and places, and conceptualize the overlap of Nedajida with conservation protected areas for these focal species? Now, I use many different methods to approach these questions, and participatory mapping really helped address these highly political, highly spatial questions in very illuminating ways. So broadly defined, participatory mapping is often used to represent the spatial knowledge of local communities. And as you see here, it can take many different forms. Our research prioritized the following sub-methods, so sketch mapping and scale mapping through applications like collaborative mapping, counter mapping, and even web mapping and more. So let me provide a few examples. We used sketch mapping and sketch maps to have conversations with local partners about their communities and let them detail what was important, what was changing, what concerns or hopes they had in regards to conservation and development narratives in their vicinity. A group of local government officials drew this map together at the site of the largest population of wintering black-necked cranes in a conservation protected area and a Ramsar site. They drew significant buildings like hospitals, temples, and schools, and important ecological features like the surrounding hillsides, central river and wetland. And if you zoomed in to this particular picture at the top, you could see the names of local deities written in Dzongkha script on the mountainside. So Yulajida, Nedajida, whose hillside territories surround Pobjika's wetland. Just like humans' relationships with wildlife, community relationships with local deities need to be cultivated, tended, and cared for, mainly through annual rituals and ceremonies, as well as through the enforcement of social and communal rules, such as not cutting down trees within the deity's territory or entering during the wrong time of year. And we use sketch mapping methods frequently to this end, and they illuminated a lot about different local community priorities and concerns. Here are a couple of videos where different partners describe the maps that they chose to draw with a blank sheet of paper, referencing different local deity classes embedded in and around their communities. So the first video refers to a deity class known as Alu, which are household scale subterranean serpent deities, more or less. The second refers to a deity class known as Tsen, which are settlement community scale mundane unenlightened deities often found in cliff sides. So there he is describing a lu near his house. So in this video, he's describing his community. He's saying, here's our temple, and here is our community's Tsen. And Tsen is a kind of local deity. Gachegi Tsen, he said. So we employed other participatory mapping methodologies that benefited group conversations, using a printed scale map to label important places on the landscape. Anything from, say, previous sites and sightings of black-necked cranes or development projects underway and large environmental changes, in addition to the names, abodes, and territories of local deities. This was a highly effective method for understanding the territorial and spatial nature of deities and their proximity to conservation protected areas, as it allowed community members to discuss with one another their shared experiences and knowledge of these more than human beings. This process also allowed us to have cross-generational conversations, which is important in this context because evidence suggests that much of this knowledge is likely not being passed down to the next generation. Now, interestingly, the process of mapping was oftentimes more illuminating than the end product, as the spatial negotiations that occurred in consultation across generations, across genders and occupations, illuminated co-constituting socio-cultural realities and spatial ontologies. For instance, this man in this map describes the territory of one of their most powerful local deities in his region, and he does so using the topography shown in this map. So while these maps as end products were certainly valuable and highlighted often marginalized viewpoints and perspectives of local community members involved and participating in conservation agendas, they were still quite flat. Inanimate coded data points that could be uploaded as points and polygons in a GIS. So the orange tags here in the picture in these maps for place names and toponyms, yellow tags for local deities and non-human spirits. These maps, like all maps or any map, were lacking, unrepresentative of the lived phenomenological worlds of our research partners, the spatial ontologies they represented, and the unseen beings that share these conservation protected areas. Indeed, protective and protected territorial deities that have their own diversities, Nedajida, Yulajida, Tsen, Lu, Nepo, Kela, found in almost every corner of the country. So I asked myself, what would or could maps look like that stretched the built-in Western cartographic rules and assumptions of a bird's eye view satellite printed topographic map from Google Earth? How could maps we created together with community local communities counter these forces in culturally salient ways. So I've had this idea to not simply integrate and weave our participatory mapping data into a database and a computer for research purposes, but to create a more animate, painted map series done in the traditional Tibetan and Bhutanese style of tanka and debris. So I partnered with one of Bhutan's most well-known traditional contemporary artists, Mr. Gyempo Wangchuk, to paint a series of maps based on our ethnographic research that highlight the many deities that share these conservation protected areas. And in this case, across the high altitude wetland valleys of the black-necked crane. This was a product that community elders said they would greatly value and would be an important way of documenting their knowledge of local deities and their territories for the next generation. It sounds complicated, right? Believe me, it is incredibly involved and complicated, and to be done properly and fully would require a lifetime, or I'm convinced perhaps multiple lifetimes. So with just a few minutes left, let me explain how we went about creating these visualizations, a corner of the map in which you see here in this photo. In the relatively small community of Bumdaling, we found that we could map hundreds of local deities and non-human spirits, some known by name, others known only by their ecological markers or through stories. Participants highlighted the most powerful and significant deities found in most of the community's annual rituals, and they gestured to them here in the blue circles, found surrounding community rice paddy fields and the central foraging and roosting sites of the black-necked cranes, their local home range marked here in the yellow polygons in the center of this map. Here is a 3D version of that same map brought into a GIS, limited as its applications may be, to bring out the topography of these flat maps. Gyempo Wangchuk and our other artistic partners drew from local perspectives, oral literature, our ethnographic data, collaborative mapping results. We consulted hundreds of religious terma texts and religious authorities, oral histories and local languages, and as best we could, we projected that onto the map. We used a projector to project it onto the map, creating a painted map that was geographically and topographically accurate. So down to every river, valley, stream, slope, and aspect of every hillside, old growth forest patches in a dozen different watersheds, just in a single map. So the result being an ecologically rich and culturally storied map in a GIS that informed a map done in the style of Tibetan and Bhutanese tanka and debris. That not only highlights the central protected areas for black-necked cranes, the community ornithologies of these places, but also the socially protected territories and protective agency of local deities of Bumdaling, depicted with their many minute characteristic details described in our community discussions and by consultation with authorities and religious pecha texts, reflected spatialized ontologies. So with support from the Ministry of Home and Cultural Affairs and the Department of Culture in Bhutan, we endeavor to complete 4 more of these maps across the major crane habitats and with the communities that call these places home. As integrative conservation researchers, if we endeavor to be inclusive knowledge holders and weavers and think critically about the conservation project, then we can benefit communities and their traditions, as well as the habitats and territories of non-human and more than human actors. Then our work can be more inclusive and equitable while challenging dominant paradigms in productive ways. So thank you all so much for your time and attention. I'm really looking forward to sharing in a social hour with you and Dr. Brondizio's talk in the afternoon.
Thank you, David. That was awesome. Samira has a question. As a researcher, how do you stay objective and not get emotionally attached to your subject? Was this a challenge for you during research?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Samira. Yeah, of course that was challenging, and of course, you know, I've always struggled with wanting to do justice to these cultural complexities that, you know, I will always be an outsider too. I think in those circumstances, all I could really do was, I really relied on my institutional partners. So my colleagues and friends at the Royal Society for Protection of Nature, who have formed these long-term partnerships with the communities that we're partnering with. And so I also feel grateful that even prior to my graduate work, I spent time here with RSPN, and a number of our interlocutors are, friends of mine. I've stayed in their houses. They've been kind enough to host me, and I think that really helped to forge early relationships that even preceded this graduate work. And I know that's not, common for many, but it was really, I think, ultimately beneficial for me.